Ravi. So let me come in. Please go. Thanks. Right. I think there's somebody who hasn't muted the microphone. Could you please do that? Just mic. Okay, thank you. As I said before, we discussed the teaching of poetry. Let's think about literature in general for a little while. What is literature? Here are 5 famous quotations on literature from a very popular book, Literature and Language Teaching by Gillian Laza, which he wrote in 1993. Take a look at this. Literature could be said to be a sort of disciplined technique for arousing certain emotions. So there are 3 things here. One, it's a technique that all of us don't possess, but which I suppose can be acquired. But it's a technique that demands a great deal of professional discipline. And what do you do with this technique? You use it to arouse emotions. The kind of emotions that Craig Raine did in that extract I read out to you about Martians. But certainly, this technique doesn't have to be deployed with an instructional text like text A that we came across a little while ago. Famous quotation again. Great literature is simply language charged with meaning to the utmost possible degree. Ezra Pound, mentor and friend of T.S. Eliot, right? So essentially what Pound is saying is, all of us use language, but what literary greats do is redeploy the same language for a purpose. And that purpose enables them to infuse meaning that you and I perhaps are not capable of. So in the fewest lines, in the fewest words possible, a poet is able to convey emotions, feelings, ideas, etc., which are normally not possible with others who use the same language. Selden's quotation: practical language is used for acts of communication, while literary language has no practical function at all and simply makes us see differently. I think that is the key. We are able to observe something that is not possible with non-literature. So that sense of perspective that we acquire by delving deeper and deeper into good literature, great literature, comes with training. And once you're trained to see different perspectives other than the banal, mundane ones that we grow up with, literature begins to make an impact on all of us. Fourth quotation. If I pore over the railway timetable, not to discover a train connection, but to stimulate in myself general reflections on the speed and complexity of modern existence, then I might be said to be reading it as literature. Interesting, isn't it? So normally, somebody who uses the railway timetable uses it for a very utilitarian purpose. But suppose you decided that the same banal, ordinary piece of print can actually make greater sense, in the sense that literary writing does, then you have converted that source into a literary text. Now, all that he's saying is literary writers are capable of doing the extraordinary. They can turn even a timetable into literature. Last quotation. Literature is the question minus the answer. Fantastic quotation, isn't it? Right? Literature makes you ask all kinds of questions, but it rarely gives you answers. Right? And that's the beauty of literature. So 450 years after Shakespeare stopped writing, we still read him with pleasure, with understanding, and scholars all over the world continue to work seriously on his plays and his sonnets and obtain PhD degrees. No one will ever say, I've now got all the answers to the questions that come to mind when we read Shakespeare. So great literature will remain so because it will continue to pose challenges to readers for posterity. As I said, sorry, source is Literature and Language Teaching by Julian Lazar. Can I let in 7 people, please?
तो हमें बुला ले जाए बेटा मैं भी अंजा हटना वो क्या स्टैंड है
Right. Sorry about that. Right. Right. There are 2 new faces. Okay. Hardcore teachers of language have sometimes questioned the inclusion of literary texts in an English curriculum. In fact, when the CBSE decided to revise its curriculum in the late 80s, one of the strongest proponents of a non-literature curriculum was from Britain, right? The person obviously thought that Indian textbooks were full of literary texts, and his argument was, if you don't even know how to operate plain English for everyday purposes, how are you going to tackle the language of literature? So why have literature at all? Let's teach it for very clear utilitarian purposes. But some of us on that committee said, no, we can't throw literature out altogether. We want both language and literature. Now, what are these objections to literature? These objections, the principal objections to literature, rest on the argument that the overriding aim of teaching English is to develop the learner's communicative competence, not to produce creative writers, and that literature is a luxury that an English curriculum can ill afford. Julian Lazar lists 6 reasons that put these objections to rest. She argues that we should teach literature, well, in the form of poetry, drama, fiction, and other literary genres in the English language classroom for 6 reasons. And here they are. 1, literature is a stimulus for language acquisition. So you need literature to expand your command of the language. Two, we'll come back to some of these ideas later. Two, literature is perhaps the only source that we know of as teachers that helps develop students' interpretative abilities, right? The ability to read between the lines, right? To get at underlying meaning, for instance, is something that comes naturally to trained readers of literature. It's fun and students enjoy it. In fact, students, very young students, enjoy listening to limericks, and so do we, right? You remember one of those famous limericks? There was a young lady of Raiga who smiled as she rode on a tiger. They returned from the ride with the lady inside and a smile on the face of the tiger. Right? That's a limerick. But see how much it says about the perspective that we couldn't have got if I had simply told it to you in prose. 4, literature is highly valued and has a high status. So even today, professors of literature are highly venerated and rightly respected for their scholarship. So somebody who has a PhD in Shakespearean studies, let's say from Oxford or Cambridge, stands apart from all of us. They are in a league of their own. 5, literature expands students' language awareness. So when they see the same language that they otherwise use for writing a personal letter or a business letter, in the form of literature, they discover that the same language has now been transformed into something very, very pleasurable. There's a lot of disturbance there. Could you mute your microphones, please? Right, I'll come back to you in a moment. The last reason why we need literature, and that's a very important reason. It encourages learners to talk about their opinions and feelings. Go back momentarily to text A and text B. You can't show text A to a group of learners, middle school or high school learners, and say, what kind of feelings do you have now reading this? What kind of feelings can you have when you're reading something that has to do with the operation of a telephone? But the same group of learners, if they can cope with the underlying meaning of text B, will actually be personalizing their responses and talking to you about how that piece of literature has impacted them momentarily. So the same source again. Now, there are 5 more people. Again, I'll take a minute's a pause for a minute. All done. Right. Are we all back? Okay. Since we began this session by referring to a telephone, let me read out a celebrated poem on racial prejudice by the Nigerian Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka. Telephone conversation, which many of you, I'm sure, have read, right? Telephone Conversation was written by Soyinka in 1963 after an experience that he had in the suburbs of London. It's a conversation on the telephone in England between a white landlady and the speaker, Soyinka, a black African-American man. The speaker has seen the landlady's advertisement in the newspaper and calls her from a telephone kiosk to ask if she will rent out her apartment to him. Here's the poem, Telephone Conversation. The price seemed reasonable, location indifferent. The landlady swore she lived off premises. Nothing remained but self-confession. Madam, I warned, I hate a wasted journey. I'm African. Silence. Silenced transmission of pressurized good breeding. Voice, when it came, lipstick-coated, long gold-rilled cigarette holder pipped. Thought I was foully. How dark? I had not misheard. Are you light or very dark? Button B, button A, stench of rancid breath of public hide and speak, red booth, red pillar box, red double-tiered omnibus squelching tar. It was real. Tamed by ill-mannered silence, surrender pushed dumbfounded to beg simplification, considerate she was, varying the emphasis. Are you dark or very light? Revelation came. Oh, you mean like plain or milk chocolate? Her assent was clinical, crushing in its light impersonality. Rapidly, wavelength adjusted, I chose West African sepia, and as an afterthought, down in my passport. Silence for spectroscopic flight of fancy, till truthfulness changed her accent hard on the mouthpiece. What's that? Conceding, don't know what that is. Like brunette, madam, that's dark, isn't it? She said. Not altogether. Facially, I'm brunette, but madam, you should see the rest of me. Palm of my hand, soles of my feet are a peroxide blonde. Friction, caused foolishly, madam, by sitting down, has turned my bottom raven black. One moment, madam, sensing her receiver rearing on the thunderclap about my ears. Madam, I pleaded, wouldn't you rather see for yourself? Well, Soyinka's poem continues to be relevant to India and at the moment to the USA, where George Floyd was a black American, was actually killed by a white policeman. And in India, don't we hear of house owners not wanting to rent out their houses or flats to African students or people who belong to a certain community or people who are non-vegetarian? I remember, for instance, when we returned, my family and I, we returned from London. And before we moved into staff accommodation at the Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages, we rented a portion of our house, nice large portion. And the landlord, I might call him that, that's an old-fashioned way. The owner was a teacher of physics, very nice gentleman, Ramakrishna. After we had done the deal, he said, sir, I have only one request. You can buy and eat and cook whatever you want, but please don't fry fish in this house, right? I can't stand the smell of fish being fried. And we agreed. Okay, so for the couple of months we stayed there, we kept off fish altogether. Okay, now let's shift our attention to poetry. All of you have been teaching poetry at various levels, but have you seriously asked yourselves why you're teaching poems in the first place? If you have, you'll agree with the three most popular reasons for teaching poetry. Sorry. One, poetry can enrich the aesthetic sensibilities of language learners. Aesthetic, as you know, refers to what is beautiful around us, right? Second reason, poems can stimulate their imagination, the learner's imagination. Three, poems can reinforce their sense of speech rhythm. Now, very important aims, reasons why we should continue to teach poetry, certainly at the school level, right? Now, let me elaborate the three statements a little bit. A good poem not only has the potential to appeal to different learners in totally different ways, but can be made accessible in the classroom on varying levels of meaning. That is, in a mixed ability English class, the teacher can use the same poem to develop different layers of understanding and appreciation in learners of varying proficiency levels. Essentially, then, we are saying that a piece of work created by a literary craftsperson can mean different things to different readers. Look at this red rose now, right? Pretty, isn't it? Some of you trained in literature, you'll immediately recall Robert Burns's well-known poem, published in 1794, "My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung into." Now, for Burns, a red rose was a symbol of passionate romantic love. Now, look at this bouquet of red roses, right? To the florist who sells the red roses to me, the bouquet means a sale of 500 rupees. When I present the bouquet to my wife, the red roses are a way of saying, sorry, I forgot your birthday, right? And hopefully, for my wife, the red roses are a token of my love and affection, as well as an acceptance of my apology. Rose. So look at the different ways in which the same word has an impact on different people, right? Talking about, sorry. Right, sorry. Talking about roses, I recall what happened to two very old English teachers who used to meet every day. And one particular morning, they met in Teacher A's house. And Teacher A's wife went to the kitchen to make some tea for the two teachers, the two friends. And while she walked into the kitchen, Teacher A said to B, "My wife and I had a wonderful time last night. I took her to a great restaurant." And B said, "Which restaurant was this?" And A said, "I can't quite remember the name. I think it's named after a row or
You can go ahead, sir.
Paul sir is muted.
Dear sir, you have muted yourself.
Oh, okay. Now, when did this happen? Before I started the joke, is it?
Before you started the joke.
Okay, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. So it's only at that point that A turned in the direction of the kitchen and said, Rose, what's the name of that restaurant we went to last night? Okay. Now it's obvious. Okay. Renu, just please come. Sorry, the screen's frozen.
What's the problem, sir?
Just a minute. Yeah. You have to restore the screen, Ravi.
Yes.
Have you done it?
Yeah, I've done it, sir.
Okay. Oh, great. Great. Okay. Now it's obvious straight away, isn't it, that teaching poetry is a challenging task. Why is it so? I'll give you a few reasons why teaching poetry is not always easy. One, a poem may use words that are unusual, obscure, and archaic. It's not always easy at the elementary level, for example, to convince a few learners that the sentence, "Thou art my God," simply means "you are my God" in current English. Two, a poem may use word order that is shockingly different from that of a prose text. The poet Thomas Hood used the phrase, "with fingers weary and worn," instead of the prose word order, "with weary and worn fingers." The poet John Dryden used the inversion, "my dearest daughter, at your feet I fall," instead of the predictable prose word order, "my dearest daughter, I fall at your feet." Three, a poem may contain complex thoughts. T.S. Eliot's monumental poem, The Wasteland, discusses ideas related to religion, death, rebirth, etc., and the waning or influence of religious faith, all of which are beyond the understanding of a school learner of poetry. 4, a poem may use symbols and imagery. Now listen to 6 lines from W.H. Davis's poem, The Rain. It's only an extract. I'm reading that out to you. I hear leaves drinking rain. I hear rich leaves on top, giving the poor beneath drop after drop. 'Tis a sweet noise to hear these green leaves drinking near. You notice in this poem, Davis uses the symbol of rain to highlight the different classes of society. He does this by describing the way the upper leaves benefit from the rain first, and they then hand down the rest to the lower leaves. In the same way, the rich pass on the leftover benefits to the poor. This poem is therefore a good example of Robert Frost's definition of poetry. And remember,